I need Annika to take us live. Good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we're going to continue hearing testimony on H238 and also proposed changes to the structure of that bill. And we first welcome Bill Driscoll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The record, William Driscoll with Associated Industries of Vermont, represent primarily the manufacturing sector in the state. As such, as you can imagine, we've been very much involved in the discussions around legislation to regulate chemicals in products. We've also worked hard to try to bring together various both Vermont and national industry stakeholders to coordinate sort of engagement on these bills. The last two major ones were ones that we worked on very closely in that way. S25 was enacted last year, which added a number of products to the list of those banned for PFAS or scheduled to be banned for PFAS. Most of those being, actually, I think at this point, all of them are, most of those are for next year. We also, in the previous legislature, worked on S20, which introduced restrictions on food packaging and some other products as well. Food packaging was the main focus of it. I think it's fair to say that there's very widespread interest in and efforts across manufacturing to move away from PFAS to the extent and at the pace possible. There is still the recognition, though, that to come up with safe and effective and available alternatives to PFAS is not something that happens overnight. It takes a lot of work and expense and innovation to find alternatives, either actual alternative materials or alternative methods. But nevertheless, that work is ongoing. So our primary interest in this type of legislation is to make sure that the goals in terms of what is going to be restricted or prohibited and when are achievable. And that's the primary thing, so that we don't end up in a situation where products, including very important products in everyday life, may not be available in Vermont. For the most part, S20 and S25 were largely achieved that. I think there are some concerns with some specific products. I think there would be an interest in revisiting some of the criteria or scope for cookware in particular. But I would encourage the committee to hear from that industry specifically so that they can go into the reasons why they would like to revisit that. If they have not been in contact with the committee yet, I believe that they will be imminently. So,
Who represents them?
There's a couple of industry groups. So I can't remember that. I think CSA might be one of the acronyms, but in any case, I'll be happy to reach out to them again to make sure that they have tried to get in touch with the committee. So turning to as well, originally the report and draft recommendations under Act 131, which was S25, did raise a number of concerns that went beyond what we were dealing with the previous legislation. We used to saying S bills for chemical bills, so I apologize for that. H238 certainly narrowed the scope a bit from that original draft proposal, which addressed some of the areas of concern, but there's still some remaining largely surrounding the sort of maybe perhaps unintended consequences of moving a number of definitions and other things around in statute. Sometimes things get lost in translation or whatnot. And then I know the committee hasn't taken an official position, but to the extent you may be looking at sort of following the general approach that was raised by Matt Chapman earlier this week, I think we're generally supportive of sort of the structure of that approach in terms of trying to narrow down and minimize changes, try to leave as much of current law in place as possible. Nevertheless, we still have some concerns and some suggestions for that. So I'll try to focus my comments and I do apologize for not having written comments for you. I'm still working on some language and whatnot, but I'll definitely be providing that to you as soon as possible. Some concerns that we'd like to see addressed and perhaps some additions or modified additions back from earlier stages of the legislation to reintroduce. So just try to focus on those. Above all, I think as you've sort of heard from other industry stakeholders, and I imagine we'll continue to do so, one of our biggest concerns is with the expansion of the definition of intentionally added. This gets to a number of issues. One, sort of conformity or alignment with other states, so that the rules and criteria are as uniform as possible across the states that are regulating PFAS. But then also some concerns about achievability as well. So Vermont has been using, as other states that have regulated or listed products to ban PFAS, intentionally added as basically the purposeful use of PFAS in a product because it's actually performing a function in the product. There's a reason why it's in there. You put it in there deliberately. If you have Matt Chapman's language, basically the current definition is intentionally that means the addition of a chemical that serves in a product that serves an intended function in the product component. So it's a very simple, straightforward. The manufacturer is using it on purpose. They know they're using it, therefore they know that they have to and can stop using it when the time comes. Only Rhode Island currently has scheduled in its statute an expanded definition of that includes manufacturing processing. I think the most obvious or probably easiest to understand, for example, would be a mold releaser or some sort of use of PFAS to make sure that the product isn't sticking to the machinery. That's just a basic fundamental function. But depending on how you define PFAS, it could, in the manufacturing process, it could be much wider than that. It could get into gaskets or other elements of the machinery, kind of bleeding over to the impurities discussion. If you're using water in your manufacturing process and it has PFAS in the water, is that going to be triggering that or not? I think to the extent that the definition was put on the table earlier this week, moves away from impurities, that helps clarify that area a little bit, but not entirely. So if the issue with the manufacturing process is, well, there's been a great deal of progress in removing PFAS from an actual ingredient or component of a product, it's uncertain whether there are going to be alternatives to some of those fundamental manufacturing processes applications that we can actually find alternatives for everything. Certainly by the timeline of this legislation, be it 2028, which is the original trigger point, but certainly. And I was talking to Matt. I don't know if this was intentional or a hard position or recommendation of ANR, but his draft moves the date up to 2027, which is even less time to try to secure alternative to PFAS in the manufacturing process. So the concern that there may not be alternatives, some remaining concerns about tightening up the language to be very specific of what we're actually talking about in the manufacturing process. We're not picking up sort of ancillary uses of PFAS. Those are just issues that we feel would be better to, at a minimum, hold off on making that expansion. Originally, our proposal in early stages of this process was to add, just as the agencies were supposed to report back on how do we tackle complex durable goods, add, well, how do we, can we reasonably and fairly impose bans on PFAS in the manufacturing processes. Given that over that time, perhaps some other states would be taking a stab at it. B, what we would see, hopefully, get some lessons from Rhode Island. If they don't delay it, they've already delayed their effective date once, which is now 2027. As they get closer to that, they may realize that they are not going to be able to meet that and move it again, or maybe everything will work just fine, and we'll know that, well, okay, this is an area where we can go without creating unintended consequences. But either way, we would just strongly urge to stick with, no pun intended, the definition of intentionally added that Vermont has relied upon for the products that we've already either banned or scheduled for banning, and also remain in alignment with the other states that also have similar laws. For the most part, like I said, apart from Rhode Island.
Can you give us a sense of what industries you're talking about?
Well, it might be different from company to company, but definitely like if you have a process that is using molds or extruders or whatnot, where materials are moving in contact with machinery, those are areas where you can find that.
I know that, but like,
Yeah.
who's making the product, and like, what's the product that you're saying is necessary to functioning society? And like, so I guess I need to know examples of what products you're talking about.
Well, I mean, there's a number of plastic or metal products that are, I would not be able to say with confidence that whatever one particular company or one particular product uses it or not. It's more of a general category of uses that are sort of generally understood. But I can try to reach out to folks to see if I can get more examples of sort of general categories of products like that.
And that would be great, because if talking about my tea mug,
Mhm.
I don't want the lubricant on the mold to be PFAS.
Fair enough.
So,
If, again, just for the sake of discussion, if it's not possible to make tea mugs without it, then that would be an issue for folks. So that's the kind of situation where we're trying to avoid that.
that would need to be labeled.
Well, labeling is a whole other discussion, which we're happy to talk about that if it comes up. But I know that not to get sidetracked too much on labeling, but labeling of products was discussed in the Senate committee last year, and apparently there's a number of potential federal preemptions that limit the ability for labeling. But like I said, that was not a very lengthy discussion, so I don't know how that would have ended up. So.
Representative Bartholomew, Tagliani.
We've had industrial manufacturing equipment for a long time now.
Mhm.
How did these machines work before these chemicals were available?
Well, obviously, some of these chemicals have been being used for some time, and I imagine that the further back you go, the less sort of sophisticated or complicated the manufacturing processes might be. Like molds and extruders might be an example of that. There also may have been practices that were not very effective or efficient relative to today. I don't think it's the case that we would feel that there's never going to be a way to not use PFAS in manufacturing. It's just a question of making sure that if and when there's a deadline for banning it in the manufacturing process, we just want to make sure that that's going to be achievable in all those instances.
I guess my point is there was a long time when we didn't use it at all. Somehow managed to manufacture a lot of stuff.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's not a situation for all products. I think as products have become more sophisticated and technology is advanced, there's just a lot more things being manufactured than there was in the past.
Yeah,
a lot more complicated things. So,
Representative Taglia via Pritchard and then Austin.
Using the example of the chair's teacup or mug, if it was used as a release agent, how long possibly would the residue remain on that item, and could it be rinsed or washed off prior to leaving manufacturer?
Well, I think as a general rule, you know, processes try to avoid any residues being left on products. I think depending on how you word, you know, definition of potentially added, I think I've seen, it might be Rhode Island where, it's stipulated that for whatever reason, the PFAS remained on the product, even though it will not. I think just the concerns there in terms of liabilities for companies, is if it's, you know, what is the acceptable risk? Is there, you know, a 0.5% chance that there might be a drop of PFAS that made it through? You know, that's,
We check to see.
I think it's just challenging to see, you know, to try to incorporate that in any sort of definition that doesn't leave a lot of uncertainty and risk for manufacturers.
Pritchard.
So I'm just curious, and you may not be able to answer this question,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the unintentional use with the water involved in the process.
Mhm.
Do most of these manufacturing plants have their own water source? Do they use
Oh, there's-
municipal
it's-
water sources? Do they?
It's all over the place. Some have dedicated wells, some use municipal water, you know, it's, if you, honestly, it's a function largely of where the facility might be located, how much water they require and what's available, so. For those that use water.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing I'm just trying to think
Mm-hmm.
about. If you're getting your water from a municipal water source, then does the municipality now become part of that?
So,
Part of that concern?
I don't,
Because
yeah,
they provided the water with the
yeah,
PFAS in it.
you know, when you're talking about legislative language, it's always
Yeah.
important to imagine all possibilities, but I imagine they probably wouldn't be considered part of the supply chain.
They wouldn't be?
I wouldn't, well, in the sense of supplier, therefore being in the chain of compliance certification. But I suppose it's fair to,
Well, and
To think about that
we're
more.
testing for PFAS in our public water supply, so.
right? And if it's there, then
Managing for it.
if PFAS is present, you know, it's hard to avoid that coming into contact with the manufacturing process if you're reliant upon that water source.
In Vermont, we may be, but maybe other states aren't. So if they're not, then how do you separate that responsibility? Or who shares in that responsibility?
Yeah, I think honestly, it would come down to how sort of the terms are defined, you know, yeah. And whether, yeah. You've got my brain now working. I'm not, if you've identified a problem or not, so,
Well, that's probably a legislative council question.
yes.
So to be clear, you're advocating for, looking at Matt Chapman's testimony from February 19th. And the changes to intentionally added, you do not support.
Right, we would like to retain current Vermont definition. Yeah.
Questions? Yeah, Sacco.
I was only like halfway through.
Okay, great.
When I raise anticipation that once the questions are done, I'm gonna
To know.
leave.
Yeah, I would just, I'd love to, following up on the chair's question earlier about what kinds of products we would be talking about, because I think it's really important, because there might be certain products that it's really hard to find alternatives by any given date. And we might just decide that as a society that maybe we don't need those products at all. Like maybe those just aren't important enough to probably weigh against the adding these poisons to our environment that it's not worth it. So I think really knowing, what products we're talking about really matters here. And I think that goes for the definition of intentionally added too, that there might be certain products where, I could see the point that it would be hard to comply in a reasonable way for certain products. But again, for other products, maybe those are products that we don't have good alternatives, but again, we can live without for some period of time at least.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, we know the universe of the products that are at stake. They're the ones that are actually listed in the bill. And we also have confidence that certainly for the ones that were added in S20 and S25, that they could be manufactured without the traditionally intentionally added PFAS. What we don't know is not so much, maybe, to be fair, it's probably more accurate not to say whether alternatives can be found, but when can they be identified and incorporated into the manufacturing process. So the question is whether society or most people would look down that list of products and feel that they want to have access to them. We don't know what we don't know. So we don't know which ones would not be able to, at least at this point, I do not know which ones would not be able to meet that definition. It's just that there's, I think there's uncertainty and risk that would be the case. And we just feel it'd be more prudent to, have the time to better assess where we are at today, and then what might be the reasonable time frame for eliminating isolated uses of PFAS in the manufacturing process, and frankly benefit from the fact that Rhode Island has effectively volunteered to be the guinea pig in this. And I think that it'd be more prudent to do that rather than change this definition when we would have to sort of see what happens with the products that are already in compliance under the current definition, what disruption there may be if we change that definition.
Questions on this? Anyone, any other questions on this topic?
I would just like to echo the chair's request for some specific products that, and maybe this would help, that either could not be manufactured today without PFAS type of required manufacturing processes, or that would be much more expensive if they were manufactured without PFAS in their manufacturing. Does that kind of help? If we could have something specific, I mean, I can think of some off the top of my head, but I wouldn't want to say they're not here without hearing them come from you.
Well, I imagine I may have to check with companies before I get specific.
Yeah, thank you for reiterating that. We do need to know.
It would be very helpful. I mean, we don't want to go, just make comments, sorry.
Yeah.
I guess I would also stress we can certainly try to narrow that down, but part of the concern is the uncertainty, and part of the uncertainty is not just what's being used now, but how confident can we be that we'll be able to find alternatives, by the time that the deadline becomes effective. Again, that's, I think, one of the advantages of seeing what happens in Rhode Island.
I guess every time you're saying the uncertainty, I feel like the uncertainty as a consumer of what might be going into our bodies is pretty important uncertainty to consider in this conversation.
Yes, but I mean, I think it's also, I think we do as much as we can as soon as we can. And I think eliminating PFAS as intentionally added is a major step forward in terms of protecting both human health and the environment from these products. And you know, it's sort of, again, you can't do everything all at once, today. And I think one of the reasons why we have a list here is that these are combinations of products that either pose the greatest exposure risk potentially, and are also, ones where the most work has gone into, removing PFAS from the product. So it's, it's a process of iterative improvement. We add additional products, we make, additional headway in finding alternatives. We're all moving in the same direction and want to move in the same direction. We just want to be cautious not to, inadvertently create a jam up, by setting a requirement that's not achievable yet.
Yeah, I think that's another reason we need specifics.
Yeah.
Representative Sakowitz.
Yeah, it seems like there's kind of a push-pull between where industry's at and where our laws are at. And we've known for a long time that these chemicals are really bad for us. So I'm wondering what kind of efforts have been made on industry's parts to get ahead of lawmaking on this. So, it seems like if I was a manufacturer and I know that my products have poison in them, that I would be working ahead of time, but no matter what the legislatures are saying, to be minimizing the exposure to my customers of these products.
Yeah, and industries have been doing that work, either, from one end of the spectrum, which, may not, certainly be enough for some folks of finding safer versions of PFAS or similar chemicals to do the same function, or finding chemicals or processes that don't require PFAS at all. That kind of work has been going on for years. I can try to reach out to Refresh. I mean, a number of trade groups they're very happy to publicize the initiatives that they've undergone to address not just PFAS, but other chemicals of concern as well, and remove them from their products. So there's a lot of that work going around. And it's often obviously sometimes it's on an individual company basis, but I think you'll frequently see specific sectors come together to kind of work to improve the safety of products for their particular sector or industry. And I'll try to make a note to see if I can maybe try to do a little survey of that for some examples. Imagine to the extent that you get written comments from some industry groups, there may well be mention of those initiatives in them. So
Before you head out, keep going on your testimony, can you remind the committee the changes that are happening in Rhode Island?
So Rhode Island has a statute on the books. I think they amended it last year. And it similarly to what we've kind of built up over S20 and S25 and the proposal now with additional products. They have a list of products that I don't know. I mean, obviously some of our products, some were banned effectively in 2023. Others are due for compliance in 2026. So I don't know the timeline for the ones in Rhode Island specifically, but their most recent legislation is effective in 2027, and that's the one jurisdiction that has a definition of intentionally added that includes the manufacturing process. It's not worded the same as Matt Chapman's proposal, but I believe Paul Burns, I believe, shared a copy of a bill previously that it wasn't the legislation that added these products or intentionally added, but the wording of the bill included the current statute, so. But, yeah, if you, I'm sure Village Council could provide you with the.
Did you submit that? Yes. Okay, so we can find that under your name. Great. We'll look at that. Thanks.
All right.
Representative Austin?
Just to clarify, are there three different definitions of intentionally added, like current Vermont? This definition and the one that Matt Chapman brought us?
I don't know. What I heard from our legislative council is there are multiples, and I asked him to bring all of them to us. So I hope that he does that.
Okay.
They're different, it's addressed different places in statute.
Yeah, I think in terms of what's been proposed, there have been two new definitions put on the table, as it were, one in the Act 31 report and one in H 238, and then the one that Matt Chapman proposed earlier this week.
Okay.
All right. So the other, in terms of that's in the bill that we're concerned about, is fluorine treated containers. These are containers, obviously you've heard a lot about them with regard to pesticide and whatnot. Because these containers, they're designed for safety in terms of basically keeping chemicals or products from being contaminated from the outside or contaminating the outside. They're fairly important, and they're fairly widely used for a number of important applications. And here again, there's progress to finding alternatives, but there's concern that some of the uses for the containers, there may not be an alternative readily available. That being said, to the extent that there are discrete cases where there are concerns and there are alternatives, we sort of feel that there may be a more targeted or deliberate approach to identifying those would be preferable. In terms of trying to figure out what that would be, and looking into this further, we're still kind of gathering some some perspective on it. I think it's worth noting here again that there is only one, as far as I know, as of right now, there is only one state that has a ban on fluorinated containers on the books. That's Maine. I believe it's effective next year. However, and I do need to follow up with Matt Chapman and others on this, because I was going over the Maine statute. It does appear to be very different than what's proposed here in the language that we're looking at. It's my understanding that the Maine statute bans fluorinated containers for the products that are scheduled for being banned under the PFAS ban. In other words, it's not all fluorinated containers. Moreover, there appears to be an exemption for when a product is subject to Department of Transportation and other agency regulation. A lot of these often these containers are used in order to comply with whether it's Department of Transportation or EPA regulations and requirements that are designed to protect public safety and other policy goals. So if we are able to sort of narrow the universe of containers of potential concern, what we would propose in addition to doing that is right now the proposal is to ban all plastic fluorinated containers plus any additional ones listed by the Secretary by rule. We would prefer to look at the scope that Maine has on the books and authorize A&R by rule to ban the use of fluorinated containers where there is a where there is a concern and there's alternatives available, and whatnot. So basically take a more deliberate approach to identifying where a ban is warranted and where it's actually achievable, rather than simply banning it broadly outright.
Again, can you give us examples of what are the products that this is necessary to us?
I can send information about what kind of products are that use these, in terms of, narrowing down where there are or not alternatives. I will have to see what I can come back for that. So
Great.
it is a wide, I've seen the list. I don't have it in front of me. I don't want to try to remember it and get something wrong, but it's pretty widely used, and it's more widely used than what Maine appears to be trying to address. So I would be concerned if Vermont is casting a much wider net than anybody else is without knowing the consequences. So those are some concerns with what's in the bill. And again, I highlight, but there are some elements from earlier drafts from S238 as H238 as introduced and as contained in the report, that we would recommend looking at retaining in the bill as you move forward. There's been a lot of talk about allowing for recycled content. I don't think I need to reiterate the pros and cons of that. I think it would be an important thing to have, so that to allow for, accommodate and encourage recycling in these products. The other thing, and this is especially important,
So just before you move on.
Sure.
The recycled containers,
recycled content.
we made a change to it from as introduced to not allow PFAS in recycled food containers.
Yes, and I have not gotten feedback from food packaging folks where they would be on that. So, because I don't know that there are other states that have food contact packaging bans, and I don't know if those states have recycled content for that particular application or not. I'd have to check on that. To the extent that they don't, then the industry is obviously dealing with those laws in other states. So. And I'm not a technical expert to address the pros and cons of PFAS and recycled food packaging. So. So the last really big issue is, this kind of gets back to kind of the whole foundation of our concerns with what we've addressed so far. The sort of the uncertainty and the risk that we may run into a situation where compliance is not possible. And what you find in other states that have similar laws, both for sort of broad consumer product bans, but also for specific listed ones, like Maine and Minnesota are examples, is something called the currently unavoidable use. In other words, say you have a compliance deadline, you're trying to meet that, but when you're getting up against that deadline, you realize that there is not an alternative, or there's something other outside of your control, and it's simply unavoidable, and PFAS is simply unavoidable, at least at that time. Again, over time, presumably all things are possible, but if you're running into a situation where it is truly unavoidable at that time, then you have this mechanism by which you have to demonstrate that, and you have to be certain standards. For example, you have to show that there's not an alternative, that meet certain criteria. Generally, in terms of alternative reviews, you see the themes of availability, affordability, and effectiveness, things like that. And especially if we have a changed definition of the manufacturing of intentionally added, or we're looking at products of super broad scope like fluorinated containers, that just makes it all that more important that we have a currently unavoidable use mechanism in the statute, so that if worse comes to worse and it's not possible to comply, that you have rather than having to try to repeal legislation and redo that, which Maine had to go through. They had to redo their PFAS laws quite extensively. That you have an orderly, criteria-based process where you can get an exemption for a limited amount of time, while you are continuing to try to come into compliance. So there was language like that included in the original 131 report and draft, and it was not included in H238 because there was an issue with when that would be available in terms of the timeline of 131. But you do see that on the ground in, again, like states like Maine. And in fact, from checking with stakeholders, it's a general feeling that Maine's language is a good model to use. When I provide follow-up comments, I'll obviously cite that and whatnot, although I'm sure Ledge Council can look it up as well in terms of Maine's currently unavoidable use language. Again, in a perfect world, it would never have to be used, but if we're facing a statutory crunch, it'd be better to have that sort of orderly process rather than having to replace legislation. So other than that, that's probably our main point. There are some people have thought about whether there can be a more efficient process if we're just looking at changing dates. But at least at this point, going with language that other states are using that are, it's a pretty commonly understood concept. I think starting from there, if we can make further improvements in terms of mechanisms as legislation continues, we'll certainly be continuing to be in touch with Matt Chapman and regulators and updating suggestions or ideas with you and other legislators as well. And I think the remaining, what I referenced earlier in terms of cleaning up definitions and other things like that, if we don't take the sort of more narrow approach, sort of structurally as Matt Chapman proposed, I'd be happy to follow up with what those concerns and suggestions are, but don't want to take up time unnecessarily here. So I think that I did make a reference. Yeah, I already made a reference to, regardless of the other details that are worked out here, that it would be, I think, prudent to go back to the 2028 effective date that was in previous iterations of these proposals. So.
In a second.
I have a question about the alternative materials that are being developed to replace some of these chemicals and chemical processes. How do we know that the alternatives that we're putting in place are at least are safer than what we're removing? We have assurances that we're not going to go through all this again. Sometime soon we find out that these new chemicals are also really bad for human health.
So I try to get information about what the current practices are. I think generally speaking, sort of the review of safety of chemicals before they are introduced into commerce is more rigorous than I think sometimes it's characterized or understood to be. There is testing, there is modeling that goes on. I am not a toxicologist, so, I couldn't explain it to chapter and verse right now, but I can try to see if I can get some overview information of how chemicals are, how are chemicals reviewed before they're used. Obviously, that was, there have been iterations of federal laws governing that, changes in best practices over time. So it's hopefully constantly improving. Obviously, it's very difficult to have a perfect system and not have things that you learn about over time. Same thing with medicines and other things like that. Sometimes things take time to get to learn about things like that entirely. But there is safety. There is safety reviews and processes that go in ahead of time for sure. Nobody wants to make a regrettable substitution. It's a very not only the human and environmental impact, but a huge financial impact if you're put all this effort into finding a better alternative and it turns out not to be better. That's an outcome that nobody wants.
Just to follow up on that, if you're able to find out from some number of manufacturers alternative products that they're using in the particular the processing process, I'm curious as to whether any of them are chemicals that they're substituting that they have experience with, or we collectively have experience with, as opposed to new chemicals coming on the market. I just think that would be really interesting and very different scenarios in my mind, because when we have history with product, we know a lot more about it in our country. So anyway, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
I think that's a very good question. As my list of things to follow up on goes down, we're getting more and more where I cannot guarantee I'll actually be able to get stuff back to you. Not that couldn't eventually, but like in the next week or two, that kind of information might be increasingly difficult.
Understood.
We want to start with people getting worried about intellectual property and confidential business information too. So
Fully understand, but anything you can provide will be really helpful. Thank you.
So just to reiterate what I think I heard you just say, I guess, you're saying that you believe that the testing of these types of products, chemicals and manufacturing processes has improved since PFAS got through? Because that's not my understanding.
Yes, I would say so. I think maybe you're referring to some people might be critical of the TSCA changes maybe, but it's my understanding that it's more rigorous than it was previously, and there was rigor before, but this is more rigorous. And certainly always if you look, I think PFAS itself was probably a major driver of regardless of what rules and regulations are governing that sort of thing, that businesses are obviously always trying to improve how they can make sure that there is not a repeat of the whole PFAS experience for sure.
Can you speak a little bit to the PFAS experience for the people you represent, the negative financial implications or impacts?
No, I don't think, I don't have information in my head in terms of financial impacts on companies specifically. All that I can just say that obviously, well, nationally and internationally, PFAS has got people's attention, but the fact that we had the contamination in Bennington certainly put it in the forefront of everybody's mind in Vermont.
Are you finished?
Yep, I think so.
Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, joining us by Zoom, Andrew Bemis.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you okay, except we missed the word here, but I think that's what you said.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what, so we got the contact. Well, great. So anyway, thank you very much for having me again. My name is Andrew Bemis. So I'm the state affairs manager with the group called the Sustainable PFAS Action Network. Quickly what SPAN was formed to do a few years ago was bring some sort of coherence and sustainability to the variety of PFAS policy discussions going on at the federal and state levels across the country. We're committed to sustainable risk-based PFAS management, and we try to advocate for responsible policies that assure long-term human health and environmental protection. Real quickly, our founding members are Honeywell and Intel, and we have a handful of other members as well across the semiconductor industries, the air conditioning, heating, and refrigeration industries, and the aerospace industries as well. We've worked very closely with Mr. Driscoll and other folks in Vermont on PFAS policy in the state. So I just appreciate the opportunity to be here virtually to give a brief testimony and then maybe answer some questions. To start here, I just have a 2 or 3 minute statement that goes over some of our issues with the legislation currently before the committee, and then maybe I can touch on some other issues and maybe answer some additional questions as well. So just to start, like I said, Andrew Bemis from the Sustainable PFAS Action Network. We're here to suggest some sensible and credible changes to the draft PFAS bill currently before the committee. Managing PFAS is a complex issue. We appreciate the committee hosting a hearing to begin to think through some of the needed elements of legislation. There are aspects of the draft which we are supportive of, such as the initial focus on consumer products. However, SPAN encourages a risk-based approach to PFAS management in Vermont and would suggest a few changes to make the legislation more effective and manageable. Firstly, to start, the definition of PFAS used in the bill is far too broad and will encompass compounds that the bill is not intended to address. While the 1 carbon atom definition of PFAS has been used in other states, it is only rarely used for bills with as potentially broad implications as the current draft. 2 states have used this definition for class-wide PFAS bills, Maine and Minnesota, which I know have been referenced before. Both of these states have had significant implementation issues that have caused delays, confusion, and overly burdensome policies for both policymakers and manufacturers in those states. Last year, Maine greatly scaled back their PFAS program, while Maine is currently considering significant changes. SPAN would also suggest retaining the language stating that for the definition that the Secretary may adopt exemptions to the definition if certain chemicals are not toxicologically similar to other chemicals in that definition. In the fall, DEC released a draft bill that contained a definition of PFAS used by EPA to implement their reporting rules pursuant to the Toxic Substances Control Act. SPAN would strongly encourage that the committee use this definition of PFAS. EPA has stated that this definition contains about 800 commercially active compounds, which will allow Vermont to target their PFAS program to the most commercially active compounds. New Hampshire has also adopted this definition in consumer product legislation last year. And I know, as was touched on in the previous testimony, SPAN would also recommend a more targeted definition of intentionally added. The definition currently in the draft is far too broad and suggests that the legislation intends to impose regulations beyond the stated scope. While the bill is initially focused on consumer products, the definition of intentionally added would encompass manufacturing processes that go beyond the concern of PFAS that may be used in the actual product. As Mr. Driscoll suggested, SPAN would suggest the definition of PFAS, or excuse me, of intentionally added that was passed in S25 last year. We would also strongly suggest the inclusion of an essential use exemption process. While the bill focuses on an initial list of consumer products, some of the bans, such as the one for fluorine-treated containers, which I know was also touched on briefly in the other testimony, those containers could encompass some used by manufacturers for the transportation, storage, and delivery of other high-purity chemicals that rely on sustainable fluorine containers as well. So just leaving essential use considerations out of the bill eliminates the department's discretion to recognize that a product with PFAS may be necessary for the health, safety, or functioning of society. And just to conclude, SPAN, we've been encouraged by some of the changes made by the committee from previous drafts, such as a reconsideration of the total ban on consumer products and the implementation timeline based on actions in other states. However, as I've touched upon, as has the previous testimony, the bill still contains some ambiguity and uses very broad definitions, and we would encourage some changes there as well. Would also note, I was listening to the previous testimony, and I know there was some discussion on certain products that use PFAS that may be necessary for an essential use exemption. I will just say it's difficult to list specific products sometimes because the use of certain PFAS, especially under a broad definition, they're used in so many different processes and products. Like I've mentioned at the top, we represent some industries that work in the semiconductor space, the air conditioning and heating and refrigeration space. So while it's difficult to say, well, this refrigerator uses PFAS in some way or another, some of our members use or produce PFAS in ways that are safe and federally approved, that are critical to 21st century manufacturing processes and other products that are part of our everyday lives. So I can work with Mr. Driscoll on maybe coming up with some examples, but I know that was mentioned a lot in the previous testimony. So otherwise, those are just some of our larger concerns with the bill. We'd love some greater attention on some of the definitions used, particularly of PFAS and intentionally added, and then the inclusion of a essential use exemption process. So as I mentioned, thank you for listening to our concerns. SPAN has been active in several states across the country, about 10 to 15. We've been very active in Maine and Minnesota. So open to any questions or comments about other states or any other parts of the bill. So I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you for your testimony. To clarify or make sure I'm hearing or not missing definition changes that you would like to see, is it really focused on the two you've mentioned, or does it go beyond and intentionally added and PFAS?
Those are the main ones we're concerned with. We think if improvements were made there, then it would go a long way towards making the bill more effective.
So you don't have changes to other definitions?
No.
Okay. Any members have questions? Did you submit your testimony in writing?
I have not yet, but I'll submit to the committee right after.
Okay. And to be clear, you're responding to H230 as it was introduced?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we took some changes proposed from DEC earlier this week that you might want to check out. They're under Matt Chapman's name on our webpage.
Okay, absolutely. I will be sure to take a look.
Okay, great. Representative Pritchard.
What parts did you specifically find ambiguous?
Well, I would say surrounding specifically some of the issues with the definition creates some ambiguity in the bill. As we mentioned at the top, we're supportive of the bill's initial focus on non-essential consumer products. I believe it's the 15 consumer product bans at the top. SPAN believes that's a good way to approach PFAS. But as Mr. Driscoll mentioned, and I
No.
emphasize the definition of intentionally added and how broad it is.
If you can hear us, excuse me, maybe you could try turning off your video.
Encompass other.
We're losing you right now, so if you could turn off your video, we might get the audio more clear. Or we might be over.
Mute.
I'll stop the video.
You can't stop it. Nope,
Oh,
he left. Looks like he left. Yeah, join. Minute.
I guess that's the question. Did he say that there were products that could be out there that have PFAS that we don't know about the impact of the PFAS on that product?
I'm not sure if I heard that. Did anyone else hear that?
No. So we,
Okay, Andrew, if you maybe would turn off your video, we might have a better chance with the audio. Be back in.
Am I back?
You're back. I think so. Let's try that.
Okay, I'll keep my video off in case that's part of the issue. Apologies, I'm not sure if that's an issue on my end, but apologies for cutting out. Um, I believe I was commenting on earlier on some of the ambiguous parts of the bill. Yeah, it's mainly the definitions that suggest that the bill could go beyond the scope of the non-essential consumer products that are initially listed in it.
Further questions? All right, thanks for joining us.
Great, well, thank you very much. Yeah,
Thank
I'll be sure to
you.
submit my testimony.
Okay. Next
Thank
up,
you.
we have Todd Titus also joining by Zoom.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
So far, yes.
All right, I'll try not to freeze up on you guys, but thank you for the opportunity to provide comment on H238. My name is Todd Titus. I'm the Director of State Public Affairs at Hardy. Hardy is a member trade association for the HVACR distributors, and it's comprised of over 1,150 member companies, more than 490 of which are US-based wholesale distribution companies. And we have nine wholesale distributor members in Vermont and 21 locations serving your HVACR contractors and technicians in the state. Vermont's been a leader in the issue of banning PFAS. However, H238 would create a prohibition for complex durable goods that would remove Vermont citizens' ability to have refrigeration and air conditioning in their businesses and homes under the definition of section 7601.10. Hardy opposes H238 unless amended to add exemptions for the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, refrigeration equipment, and refrigerants approved under the Environmental Protection Agency's significant new alternate policy program, SNAP, and exempting products that face unavoidable use of PFAS. Exemptions for the HVACR have been adopted in PFAS prohibition policies in New Hampshire, in New Hampshire and Maine, and are under consideration in Connecticut and New Mexico. Vermont's justified in seeking to reduce the use of harmful PFAS, and Hardy recognizes that not all PFAS should be considered dangerous to human health. According to a systemic review by the National Institute of Health, the three factors that create a danger to long-term human health are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic substances that can subsist for decades in human tissue and the environment. According to REACH, the European Union regulation for protecting human health, hydrofluorocarbons refrigerants do not meet the persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxicity factors necessary to make them a dangerous PFAS. Additionally, 29 out of the 30 states that have adopted PFAS policies have purposely chosen not to include or have exempted the HVACR industry. Excuse me. The New Hampshire and Maine legislatures adopted explicit exemptions for the HVACR industry from their PFAS prohibition, and the Connecticut and New Mexico legislatures have its own under consideration that adopt the similar exemptions. The EPA's SNAP program mandates the approval of refrigerants as alternatives to existing ones, including those that contain PFAS. Refrigerants without SNAP approval are not allowed to be used. Furthermore, the EPA can impose restrictions on these refrigerants based on safety considerations, such as prohibiting them because they have PFAS. For instance, the limit on the amount of propane used as a refrigerant in the refrigeration products was recently increased. However, equipment utilizing propane as a refrigerant must meet safety standards. These safety standards can prevent the utilization of non-PFAS refrigerants if there is no safe method for their use. As a result, propane, which is often suggested as an alternative to planned PFAS refrigerants, cannot be used in home air conditioning due to the lack of SNAP approval or safety standards. This indicates that PFAS has an unavoidable use due to the separate state or federal regulations and codes. Hardy asks that H238 be amended to add exemptions for the HVACR equipment and refrigerants approved under the EPA's SNAP program. In addition, Hardy asks that the committee add an exemption for the unavoidable use of PFAS, which would include state and federal regulations or codes as a valid unavoidable use category. This will ensure that if a separate Vermont or federal regulation restricts alternative refrigerant options, the initially planned PFAS-containing refrigerant will qualify for the unavoidable use exemption. As mentioned, PFAS within the HVACR system refrigerant poses fewer health risks than other PFAS sources. The legislation was designed to protect the public from health hazards associated with severe PFAS exposure. A health risk is not shared by fluorine-containing HVACR refrigerants. Hardy believes that the HVAC industry should be exempt from the PFAS prohibitions. This request is justified due to the lack of danger to human health, PFAS prohibition precedent, and enacted federal phase down to our industry. And that's all I have as a prepared statement. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
What, I have a question about the banning of complex durable goods. I believe that, I thought as introduced it is a report back on complex durable goods.
So the way it's written into the definition of consumer product, complex durable good becomes a consumer product definition under the consumer product way it's written, and it becomes and complex durable goods that contain PFAS are then banned beginning in 2033. On the bill that I saw that was introduced, I went looking for the one that you were saying. I could not find it.
Alberts, can you help us on this?
For the record, Paul Burns, with VPIRG, there was a proposed exemption for complex durable goods in the initial recommendations from the Agency of Natural Resources.
Yeah.
So I'm not, Mr. Driscoll.
Oh, Mr. Driscoll may have a comment.
In the future.
Has a comment.
There is kind of a schizophrenia in the bill, just had quite a drafting error perhaps. It still has the report on durable goods carried over from the 131 report, but it also in the definition of consumer goods, as I recall, it does pull in complex durable goods in 2033. So you have a 2032 report, but a in statute inclusion in 2033.
I think that maybe,
Yeah, I'm sure.
thank you for drawing that to our attention. That was not intentional.
And that's part of what these complicated things that we're learning about with PFAS through these prohibitions that now have taken effect over the last few years. So that's another reason why unintended consequences of certain legislation would be a good idea to have these exemptions put in place to make sure life essentials like air conditioning, refrigeration aren't accidentally hit by certain prohibitions that aren't intended for.
Yeah, I think it was just a drafting error. It wasn't a beyond that.
Right. I understand that. I'm just speaking more broadly, but then.
Yeah. Do members have questions for Mr. Titus? Representative.
So is your main concern on the durable end of it, because you're talking about refrigeration and so on and so forth, is the refrigerants themselves?
Well, we're concerned about the refrigerant themselves because we use HFCs and HFOs and our transition down away from HFCs, and these refrigerants have a fluorinated carbon chain, which qualify them as a PFAS chemical that is banned under the under the definitions. So because of that, they then themselves become a prohibited product based on prohibitions and are not able to be used not able to allow our air conditioning refrigeration units to be operational.
So I'm curious, can you tell me, I don't know how much you know about refrigerants. Did R12 and R134 contain these?
Any HFC refrigerant contains PFAS based on the definition.
Okay, so does that include YF, the YF refrigerants in all the automobiles now?
If you're to speak specifically to them, I can't name them specifically off the top of my head like that. But yes, if it is an HFC or HFO refrigerant, it is a PFAS. It is considered a PFAS. With the only ones that right now we're in the middle of a transition to A2Ls, and under the EPA's definition of PFAS, the two most common ones for residential would be an R454B and R32. Under the EPA's definition, these both would not have PFAS, be a PFAS refrigerant. However, there are still several ones that are in the market, such as commonly used R410A, for that those A2Ls are replacing, that are going to be in the market for years and years to come, not necessarily brand new, but in the process of reclaim. And that would then become a prohibited substance for them to be purchased and used.
Thank you.
Members
And
have
then
it.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, the transition beyond those to what then would be forced to be used, depending on the definition, would then be natural refrigerants, and the natural refrigerants are not universally capable to be used across the market for everything right now. They are only have small uses right now in a couple commercial chains that use them, primarily in Europe. But there's not a consistent domestic use for natural refrigerants, and don't expect there to be one anytime soon.
Right, any other questions for Mr. Titus? Or any of the witnesses we've heard from so far? Not seeing any. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so members, we are going to ask Michael O'Grady to kind of integrate in the changes that Matt Chapman brought us so that we actually have a bill we can discuss. And on Tuesday or Wednesday morning, we will be able to do that. I say or because we're Tuesday afternoon, we're going to go back to 3 acre. But if there's time in that slot, we may be able to walk Michael these changes. If not, we'll do it Wednesday morning. So we're hoping to move towards something that we can be voting out next week on this one, just so you know. So, and if you have questions or concerns that are going beyond this, it's helpful to schedule time to talk to Michael O'Grady or others that we've heard from in committee and get your questions answered. And then, okay, so does anyone have anything on PFAS? Representative North.
Yes, thank you. Just wondering if Michael O'Grady is going to be incorporating some of the changes we heard about here today. Are you
Certainly
providing-
the drafting error, yes.
Yeah.
But no, I think what we'll do is because I'm having a hard time understanding how what Matt Chapman suggested fits into H238 as introduced. I think we need to see that first and then have discussion on it.
Okay. So Michael is incorporating the things that Matt Chapman put forth. And then any additional things that might have gone beyond what Matt was proposing today, from what we heard today, we'll deal with that after we see that first draft from Michael.
Yeah, so
Okay,
right.
just wanted to understand the process.
Yeah, sure. Representative Austin.
I'm just still having a hard time with the intentionally added. It seems like there's 3 different or 4 different versions of that, and I can't at this point. I feel make an informed decision about it because I don't see how they differ from one another.
Well, the important part is whether it's in the end product or in the manufacturing process. That's the key kind of what we're debating here. Is is it appropriate to be adding the manufacturing process to the definition of intentionally added?
Or I think that contaminate aspect as well, right? Like you didn't intend to add it, but it was like in the water or something, and it ends up in there. So that I think that was another aspect.
Well, I guess I feel like that we took testimony earlier this week that the definition as proposed by Matt Chapman addressed that.
It did, okay. But okay, I just want to make sure that because that was another issue that came up when I just want to make sure, okay, we're accommodating to that already. What we will see from Michael on Tuesday.
And can confirm with him, if he agrees with that.
Great, thank you.
All right, and so as a reminder, Elle is going to be taking the lead on that and working with Michael on making his changes and bringing it to us next week. And then we're doing 3 acre on Tuesday. And anything else folks want to talk about before we wrap? Representative Logan.
What should next steps be for the municipal zoning issue that we've been talking about?
we haven't been talking about it with the committee.
Yeah.
So, I guess we can, right now, we're gonna be moving, hopefully, these two topics forward as a priority in the next week.
Okay.
Okay, I think that'll be it for today. Oh, I do want, though, to make sure that maybe the budget folks could give an update on where we're at with the process. You on the spot, Representative Sacrifice?
Yeah, we got some good information from Trevor Squirrel, Representative Squirrel, who is our person on the Appropriations Committee. And he basically gave us some places where we should be following up with both DEC and Fish and Wildlife about potential gaps in what has been proposed by the governor.
And we've got some follow-up information on the requests we made that I can share with the budget group. Yeah, and so the goal here is to get a budget letter out on Wednesday, close of business Wednesday. Yeah, and if you have questions on the budget, you're gonna need to dive in and seek out answers from members on the budget subcommittee or from others. Reviewing the information we got yesterday is probably a great place to start. All right, I'm not seeing any. I can't really see Representative Pritchard back there, but I guess if I can't see him, I guess I'm gonna assume you're happy. All right, well, thanks for a good week, and we'll see you